It was just past sunset when I set out for a hike in the woods near my home. The temperature was cool but not uncomfortable, and the air was crisp with the scent of pine and damp earth. The sky had faded to a deep navy, and the only sounds were the rustle of leaves beneath my boots and the occasional croak of a distant owl. I remember feeling at peace, enjoying the stillness of the forest as it settled into night. The kind of quiet that seems to fill every space, making everything feel safe and untouched. But even in the calmest of places, something can shift, barely noticeable at first, like the low hum of a car engine just before it dies. You don't realize it's happening until it's too late, and by then it's already too quiet. I couldn't shake the feeling, but I kept walking, thinking it was just my imagination. As after all, the woods had always been my sanctuary, a place where I'd never feared the dark, until that night. It was a calm evening when my friends and I decided to take a late-night hike through the forest near our town. We had done it before, nothing too special, just a way to get out of the house and clear our heads. The air was cool, crisp with that unmistakable scent of pine and damp earth that only comes after a long day of rain. We had arrived just as the sun was dipping below the horizon, the sky still a soft purple that slowly darkened as the stars began to prick through the fading light. The forest at first felt almost inviting. It was familiar, the path well-traveled, and the darkness seemed comforting, blanketing the world in a soft, safe quiet. We talked in low voices, the kind of chatter that comes with comfort, the kind of chatter that feels like a conversation you're having with yourself, even though there are other people around. The path was narrow, winding around tall trees and thick underbrush, and we made our way through the forest with our flashlights cutting through the dark in front of us. The night was still. The only sounds were the crunch of leaves beneath our boots and the occasional distant call of an owl. There was something oddly peaceful about it, something calming in the way the world around us felt tucked away from the rest of the world, as if the forest had its own rhythm, a rhythm that only seemed to make sense when you were walking through it. But as we walked, something about the night felt off. Not obvious, not right away, but there was a slight change in the air, something I couldn't quite place. It was like the woods had suddenly become a little quieter, more expectant, as if it were listening to us now instead of the other way around. I tried to ignore it, focusing on the path ahead. That's when I first noticed the figure. It wasn't much at first, just a dark shape at the edge of the trees, barely visible in the shadows. I didn't say anything at first. I thought it was just a trick of the light, maybe one of the trees or a stump casting a shadow. But as we walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. That figure, it didn't move. It didn't have the usual shape of something you'd expect to see in the woods, like a deer or a raccoon. It was just standing there motionless, and as we got closer, I realized it was standing too still. My heart rate quickened, but I didn't mention it to the others. They were laughing, talking about something trivial, their voices muffled in the quiet. Well, the figure still hadn't moved. It was then that I started feeling the weight of the silence. It wasn't like the usual peaceful quiet of the forest. This was different, heavy, as if the night was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I glanced over at my friends, but no one else seemed to notice. They were too wrapped up in their conversation. I tried to shake off the uneasy feeling in my stomach, telling myself it was nothing. It was just a trick of the mind, perhaps a stump or a rock that looked like a person from a distance. But as we continued walking, I couldn't help but look back. The figure was still there, and now it was a little closer. "Hey, do you guys see that?" I asked, my voice a little steadier than I felt. My friend Sarah looked over, squinting into the darkness. "See what?" "That figure by the trees," I said, pointing. "It's been standing there for a while." They all turned, looking in the direction I pointed. At first, they didn't seem to notice anything out of the ordinary, but then Jason, the most observant of the group, said, "Yeah, I see it. That's weird." We all stopped walking. For a moment, no one said anything. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound, just stood there, partially hidden in the shadows. It was unsettling, but none of us said anything more. We just kept walking, a little quicker now, as if the figure had made the air around us heavier. I didn't feel comfortable, not anymore. My steps grew more deliberate, and I kept stealing glances behind me, watching the space where I'd last seen it. I wasn't sure what I was hopping for, but something felt wrong. Something felt off. Maybe it was the way the figure didn't move, or how, when I glanced back again, it seemed just a bit closer than before. As I quickened my pace, my mind racing. I kept telling myself that we were just in a remote area and the darkness can play tricks on the eyes. But that logic wasn't comforting anymore. Every step I took, I could feel the eyes of that figure following me, even though I never saw it move. It was as if it was always there in the shadows just behind me. "We should head back," I said quietly, my voice betraying me. I hadn't meant to say it out loud, but the words were out before I could stop them. "Why?" Jason asked, his voice still light, not realizing the tension that had suddenly settled over me. "We're fine." I looked at him, about to argue, when I heard it: footsteps. Quiet, careful steps, too soft to be heard if you weren't paying attention. My heart skipped and I turned to look. I thought I saw the figure move, just a flash of motion at the corner of my eye. The footsteps were too rhythmic, too close behind us to be ignored now. I froze, my breath catching in my throat, and I glanced at Sarah, hoping I wasn't the only one hearing it. But she didn't notice. Jason, too, was still laughing, clearly unaffected. I could hear my own heart thumping in my ears as I tried to focus, listening to those steps behind us. They were too synchronized with ours, matching our pace exactly. My feet were heavier now, and the air felt thick with every breath I took. I kept walking, but it felt like something was holding me back, like the shadows themselves were pulling at me, unwilling to let go. Well, the footsteps continued. Step, 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 closer now, always in sync with mine. I turned around again, trying to catch a glimpse, but nothing was there. The space was empty, as it should have been, but my skin crawled with the feeling that I was being watched. I wanted to scream at them to stop, to hurry up, but my voice was caught somewhere deep in my chest. We couldn't be that far from the car now, but it felt like the path had stretched on forever. I glanced at Jason. He had stopped laughing. His face was pale now, and his eyes were locked on something in the dark behind us. He was breathing a little faster, his body stiff. Without saying a word, we all started to pick up the pace, but the footsteps didn't stop. They were louder now, faster, as if whatever it was had started chasing us. We broke into a full sprint, the sound of our breath ragged and urgent, but still the footsteps followed, the shadows deeper, darker, the air colder with each second. When we finally reached the clearing where we had parked, we didn't even slow down. I glanced back one last time, expecting to see nothing, but there it was. The figure standing just at the edge of the trees, watching us from the shadows. Its face was obscured, but the stillness, it was as if it had always been there, waiting for us. We piled into the car, the engine roaring to life, and we sped off. I didn't look back, but the feeling of being watched never left me. Even now, when I think about it, the question lingers. Who was that figure and what did it want? All I know for sure is that whatever it was never supposed to be there. And it still haunts me in the quiet spaces where the shadows lie in wait. I've always loved hiking at night. There's something peaceful about it, the way the forest feels like it's all yours, how the sounds of the day fade into quiet. The night air is cooler, sharper, and there's a kind of stillness that only comes when the sun has long gone. So when my friend Sarah suggested a midnight hike on one of the more challenging trails near our town, I didn't hesitate. We had done it before, never alone but with a group, and it had always been one of those experiences that left you feeling like you had discovered something secret. But this time, it would be just the two of us. We had been walking for about half an hour when I first noticed the change. The trail was familiar, a narrow path that wound through the trees, disappearing into the thick underbrush. The moon was full, casting its silver light across the ground, enough to make the shadows feel more alive, yet not enough to dispel the soft gloom that settled over the forest. The temperature had dropped noticeably since we started, and I pulled my jacket tighter around me. The sounds of the night were quiet, almost too quiet. The rustling of the leaves underfoot was the loudest noise we'd made in minutes, and even the wind seemed to have died down. We had been talking, like we usually did, about our usual random topics, but the further we went, the more I felt this strange heaviness in the air. It wasn't like the usual peaceful solitude I was used to on these hikes. No, this felt different, almost as if the forest was watching us. It was subtle, nothing obvious, but I began to feel it in the pit of my stomach, the kind of unease you can't shake, even when nothing seems to be happening. "That's strange," Sarah said, breaking my train of thought. Her voice sounded quiet in the silence, and I turned to look at her. She was standing a few steps behind me, looking down at the ground. I followed her gaze, noticing for the first time that the trail had narrowed significantly. The path, which had been wide enough for us to walk side by side, was now barely wide enough for one of us to pass through without stepping into the dense underbrush. The shrubs seemed to have encroached, almost as if the trail had shrunk somehow. "Do you think someone has been walking here recently?" she asked, though her voice didn't sound entirely convinced. I shrugged, but inside I felt a strange discomfort. Maybe. It doesn't look like it, though. The ground's pretty undisturbed. We both stood there for a moment, trying to make sense of the sudden change in the trail, but no explanation seemed to make it feel any less odd. I turned back, feeling a slight prickling at the back of my neck, and we continued. But as we walked, something about the trees around us seemed different. The shadows didn't move the way they should have. It was as though the trees themselves were watching us. It's every so often I'd hear a rustle, something too soft to be the wind, but when I turned to look, there was nothing there. I didn't say anything to Sarah. I didn't want to sound ridiculous, but the uneasy feeling in my chest kept growing, building slowly like the soft hum of a distant warning. The path ahead seemed to stretch on endlessly now, despite us walking steadily for what felt like an hour. There were no other hikers, no one at all. And the silence had deepened, so much so that when I spoke, my voice felt like it was swallowed up by the trees. My footsteps felt heavier, too, like I was dragging myself through the darkening world. I glanced back over my shoulder. The path behind us didn't look quite the same as it had when we first started. The trees were positioned differently, the shadows cast at odd angles. My breath caught in my chest, and I told myself it was nothing, just my mind playing tricks on me in the darkness. But when I looked back, the trail ahead seemed different. The trees were spaced farther apart, the path wider. I didn't remember it looking like that when we started. "Sarah," I said, my voice a little tighter than I intended. "Are you sure we're on the right trail?" She didn't look at me right away. Instead, she paused, studying the path ahead. Her expression was hard to read in the dim light, but after a moment she nodded. "Yeah, this is it. We should be seeing the clearing soon." I nodded too, trying to push away the creeping feeling that had wrapped itself around my chest. But something still wasn't right. It was like the forest was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Then, without warning, the trail forked. I stopped short, staring at the two paths in front of me. I couldn't remember a fork being here. There was no sign, no marker, no indication of which way to go. The path to the left looked almost the same as the one we had been following, but the right path, well, it seemed different. The trees were older, more twisted, and the ground was covered in thick, uneven roots. I turned to Sarah, but she was already walking toward the left path, her footsteps muffled in the soft dirt. Should we check the other way? I asked, though I felt a little silly for suggesting it. She paused but didn't turn around. I don't think it matters, the clearing's just ahead. I hesitated for a moment longer, but then, without another word, followed her down the left path. But now the forest felt even more alive. The trees pressed in closer, their branches reaching for us like hands, and the rustling of leaves underfoot became louder. I felt the distinct sensation of being watched again, more intense this time, and I couldn't shake the image of those twisted trees down the other path. Something about them had unsettled me, but I didn't want to seem paranoid. We kept walking, and the further we went, the more disoriented I became. The trail had changed, no longer smooth and even. The trees loomed over us in unnatural shapes, casting long, crooked shadows on the ground. But it wasn't just that. The ground beneath my feet began to feel different too, spongy in places, dry and cracked in others. I had a nagging feeling that we weren't on the right trail anymore. Sarah, I said, but when I looked up, I realized I was alone. The panic surged in my chest as I spun around. There was no sign of her, no indication of where she'd gone, just the cold, dense forest surrounding me. My heart began to race and I called out her name. Sarah. But my voice was swallowed by the night, the silence thick and suffocating. I took a step back, trying to retrace my steps, but the path didn't look the same anymore. The trees were arranged differently, the shadows were stretched at odd angles. The path had changed again, and it was like the forest was moving around me, closing in. I stumbled backward, my breath quick and shallow. The forest felt endless now, like I had entered some place where time didn't exist. Nothing was where it should be. The path in front of me seemed to stretch on forever, and yet every time I turned, it was as though I had walked in a circle. I couldn't remember which way to go. I couldn't remember where I'd come from. The trail had vanished. That's when I heard it, a faint sound, barely audible at first, but it was unmistakable. Footsteps, slow and steady, coming closer. And then Sarah's voice, soft, muffled, calling my name. I spun around, desperate for her, but the voice was coming from everywhere and nowhere. And then, just as suddenly as it began, the sound stopped. The world around me felt still again. The trees, the shadows, the night, everything had fallen silent. There was no trace of Sarah, no sign of the path. So I don't know how I made it back to the car, but when I did, I didn't look back. I still don't. It's every time I think about that night, the memory of the vanishing trail haunts me. The forest seemed to shift around me, hiding its secrets just out of reach, and I couldn't help but feel it. Something was waiting there. Something old, something that moved the earth around me, bending it, hiding it in the shadows. And it's still there in the dark, just beyond the edge of the light. It was a crisp fall evening when I decided to go for a walk in the woods. The days had been getting shorter and the air had started to turn colder. I loved the feeling of a quiet evening walk. There's something about the stillness of the woods at twilight that makes everything feel so peaceful. The wind was light, barely enough to rustle the leaves, and the fading light of the setting sun gave everything a soft, golden glow. I was in my usual spot, the trail near my house that cuts through the woods. It's nothing special, just a winding path lined with trees that leads to a clearing. But in the evenings, when the sun dips low and the shadows stretch long, the woods have this quiet magic about them. I've walked this trail countless times, so I didn't think much of it as I slipped into my jacket and headed out for my usual route. The air had that cool, earthy scent of autumn mixed with the crispness of the fallen leaves underfoot. My boots crunched softly on the path, the sound echoing just a bit too loudly in the quiet. The woods seemed to be holding their breath as I walked deeper into them. The last remnants of sunlight flickered through the branches, casting long, sharp shadows on the ground. It was peaceful at first, calming even. But as I kept walking, I began to notice a small, subtle irregularity. It was a light, faint at first, barely noticeable against the fading dusk. At first, I thought it was just the last remnants of sunlight flickering through the trees or maybe a distant house with its porch light on. But as I walked further, the light remained steady, a soft glow nestled just behind a cluster of trees far off the trail. It wasn't bright, not by any means, but it was there, constant, like a tiny, unnoticed star just above the horizon. I stopped, my eyes narrowing. I knew this part of the trail well, and there was no house out here, no buildings that would explain the light. It seemed out of place, isolated in the middle of the woods. The path ahead of me was clear, but the further I looked, the more I couldn't ignore it. It was too quiet now. The wind had stopped entirely, and the usual rustle of the leaves seemed to have been swallowed by the growing darkness. I told myself it was nothing, just my mind playing tricks on me. But then I noticed something else. The light, though small, seemed to be moving. It wasn't shifting in the way a distant street light would, but more like it was approaching. It wasn't flashing, but it seemed to pulse slightly as though it had a rhythm of its own, steady, almost like it was alive. A subtle unease crept over me. I was alone in the middle of nowhere, and this light, whatever it was not where it should be. The darkness around it felt unnatural, the way shadows gather around a single object in the absence of sound. The contrast between the light and the shadows made the woods feel like they were holding something back, something hidden just beyond the light's reach. I took a hesitant step forward, my curiosity pushing me, but there was a hesitation in my chest. Why hadn't I noticed this light before? How was it even here in the first place? I had walked this trail hundreds of times and never seen it. The light had been steady, but as I stepped forward, I thought I could see it flicker, almost like it was pulling away from me, hiding itself behind the trees. I could feel my pulse quicken slightly, my breath growing shallow. The air around me felt heavier, colder. A part of me told me to turn around, to go back the way I came and forget I had ever seen the light. But another part of me, the part that's always driven by a quiet curiosity, wanted to get closer. I knew the woods well, but this was new, something I didn't understand, and that made me uneasy in a way I couldn't shake. I took another step, then another, my boots crunching louder now. As each step felt like a decision, and I could feel the weight of it growing heavier with every inch I moved forward. The light was still there, but now it seemed closer, brighter, almost within reach. It wasn't exactly like a lantern or a flashlight. It was a soft, white light, warm and inviting in a way that seemed almost too perfect for the setting. The moment I thought that, a chill ran through my spine, like my mind was warning me about something. My heart rate picked up, but I pressed on, my legs moving with a mix of hesitation and resolve. As I neared the trees where the light seemed to hover, I stopped. The light flickered again just for a second, but it felt like it was more than just the natural shift in a light source. It was as if something had caused it to hesitate, like it was aware of me. For a moment, I stood frozen, staring at it. The sound of my own breathing felt too loud in the stillness. That's when I realized the sound of the woods had changed. It wasn't quiet anymore. There was a low hum in the air, almost imperceptible but steady, like the sound of an engine idling far off in the distance. I glanced around, but all I could see was the dense, dark forest. The light was still there, steady and unmoving, but now I could feel the weight of the silence pressing against me, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. The hum was growing louder, more distinct. And then the light flickered again, but this time it was different. It wasn't just a flicker. It was like the light blinked out entirely for a split second, only to reappear slightly off-center and closer than before. I froze. The light, it was moving. I couldn't explain it, but that's exactly what was happening. The light was moving closer to me. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks, but no, there was no mistaking it now. The pulse of the light, the flicker, it was drawing nearer slowly but steadily. I couldn't see what was behind it. There were no figures, no shadows, just the light inching its way toward me, and I was stuck, transfixed, my feet frozen in place. The hum was louder now, and my heart was racing in my chest. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. In that moment, something inside me snapped. I turned more out of instinct than anything and started to run. My feet thudded heavily against the earth, the sound of my breath ragged and frantic. I didn't dare look back. Every part of me screamed to get as far away from that light as possible. But as I ran, the hum followed, a soft pulse that seemed to come from every direction, like the forest itself was alive, reacting to my fear. I pushed myself harder, my eyes focused ahead, the path seeming to stretch on forever. It felt like an eternity before I finally reached the edge of the woods, the familiar sight of my car in the distance. I didn't slow down until I was in the driver's seat, locking the doors behind me. I glanced out the window, breathless, my pulse still racing. The woods were quiet again. The light was gone. But even now, when I think about that night, I can't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The forest never felt the same again. Even in the daylight, when I walk those paths, I can't help but glance over my shoulder, half expecting to see that light flickering just beyond the trees, waiting. It was a cool evening when I decided to take a walk through the old woods behind my house. I had walked this trail countless times, and it was always the same, quiet, peaceful, almost meditative. The air was crisp, and the sun was just beginning to dip below the horizon, casting everything in a soft, golden glow. The trees stretched tall above me, their leaves rustling gently in the wind. The faint smell of damp earth and pine filled my nose as I made my way down the familiar path. The crunch of dry leaves underfoot was the only sound, and for a moment I felt completely alone in the world, which for me was exactly the point. The woods were never silent, though there was always a subtle hum of life, whether it was the faint chatter of birds in the distance or the occasional rustle of animals moving through the underbrush. It was just the right kind of solitude where you could lose yourself in your thoughts without feeling lonely. But that evening, something felt different. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but as I walked, I became increasingly aware of the quiet around me. It was the kind of silence that presses against your ears, a stillness so deep it makes you uncomfortable. The kind of silence that fills a room just before someone walks in. I shook it off, telling myself it was just my imagination. The path ahead of me was familiar, the shadows of the trees falling across the trail, casting long lines on the ground. My boots clicked lightly against the dirt, the sound of my footsteps comforting in the otherwise empty air. But then, somewhere in the distance, I heard something else, a soft, almost imperceptible sound. At first, I thought it was just my mind playing tricks on me, the wind or an animal brushing through the leaves. But when I paused, the sound continued, footsteps. It was faint at first, barely audible but unmistakable, slow, deliberate just behind me. I turned instinctively to look behind me, but there was no one there. The woods were empty, just the swaying trees and the fading light. I stopped walking for a moment, letting the sound linger in the air. It was odd, though, that the footsteps didn't stop when I did. They kept going, echoing in time with mine, as if someone or something was following me. But when I looked again, all I saw were the empty trees and the long shadows stretching across the path. I began walking again, my pace a little faster this time. It was probably nothing, I told myself. The wind playing tricks, maybe even an echo from some distant hiker on another trail. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The footsteps, they were too consistent, too in sync with my own. Every time I stepped forward, there it was again, a soft crunch of leaves exactly where my foot had just been. I quickened my pace, trying to convince myself it was nothing, but as I walked faster, so did the footsteps behind me. They weren't getting closer, but they were there in the same rhythm just behind me. I stopped again, my heart beginning to race. This time I didn't turn around, though. I could hear them more clearly now, the soft rustling of leaves, the faint thud of a boot on the ground. They were still there. I stood still, the tension in the air thick, wondering if I had imagined it, if the sound had always been there and I just hadn't noticed. But the longer I stood, the louder the footsteps became. They weren't echoes of my own steps anymore. They were distinct, separate, like someone was walking just out of sight. I told myself it was nothing, just my mind getting carried away, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I took a deep breath and started walking again, this time faster than before. The footsteps, too, quickened. I could hear them behind me, just a fraction of a second too late to be my own. The same rhythm, the same pace. At first, I told myself it was just the echo of my footsteps bouncing off the trees. But as the noise grew louder, more distinct, I started to wonder. The woods were dense here, thick with trees and underbrush, and it was hard to see more than a few feet ahead, but I knew the path. I had walked it 100 times. And yet, with each step, it felt like I was being followed, like someone was always just behind me, not quite catching up but never stopping, never falling out of step with me. I tried to calm myself, to convince myself that it was just the shadows playing tricks, but there was no denying it now. The footsteps were too real, too precise. Finally, I stopped again, this time with my back to the trees, hoping that by standing still I might somehow catch whatever was making the noise. My breath was shallow now, my chest tight with tension. The footsteps stopped too. For a brief moment there was silence again, the kind of quiet that settles over you when something unexpected happens. But then, just as I started to breathe easier, I heard them again. This time they were closer, too close, almost as if the person was standing right behind me. The sound was distinct, the crunch of leaves underfoot, the weight of a body shifting on the path. It wasn't an echo anymore, it was real. I spun around, my heart in my throat, but there was nothing there. No figure, no shadow, just the empty path stretching ahead of me. I could see the trees in front of me, the light dimming now as night began to settle. The path was empty as it should have been. I was alone, but the footsteps, they didn't stop. They were still there behind me, matching my pace perfectly. I couldn't take it anymore. My legs moved on their own, propelling me forward faster than I ever thought I could move. I ran, the sound of my breath ragged, my feet pounding the earth. The footsteps followed, of course. They always did, just behind me, keeping in sync with my hurried pace. I ran for what felt like an eternity, until finally I burst out of the woods and into the open field near my house. I didn't stop running until I was inside, the door locked behind me. My heart was racing, my skin cold with sweat. I tried to convince myself that it had been nothing, that I had imagined the whole thing, but I knew better. The footsteps had been too real, too consistent. Even now, when I walk through those woods, I can still hear them sometimes. The faint, echoing footsteps that follow just behind me. Only now I know better than to look back. I've always enjoyed hiking, and when my friends and I decided to join a guided night hike in a national park, it seemed like the perfect way to unwind. We had signed up months ago, eager to get away from the bustle of the city and explore the woods at night. The guide was supposed to be experienced, leading us through one of the most scenic trails in the park, and everything about the trip seemed straightforward. The air that night was cool, a crisp autumn chill that made the quiet forest feel even more alive. The sky above was clear, dotted with stars, and the soft glow of our headlamps created shadows that danced around us as we followed the narrow trail. We gathered at the starting point, a small parking lot at the edge of the woods. There were about 10 of us in total, all bundled up in jackets and scarves, chatting excitedly about the hike ahead. The guide, a man in his late 30s with a rugged beard and an easy smile, introduced himself as Tom. He seemed friendly enough, and after a brief introduction, he led us down the trail, telling us about the history of the park and its wildlife. The air smelled of pine, and the path was soft underfoot, a mixture of dirt and fallen leaves. It was peaceful, the kind of quiet you only find deep in nature, where the world outside seems to fall away. As we walked, I found myself lost in the calm rhythm of our steps. It was easy to forget how far from civilization we were, surrounded by the hum of the forest, the wind rustling the treetops. Our guide spoke in a low voice, but it was easy to hear him, the sound of his words blending with the night. He seemed knowledgeable, sharing anecdotes about the park's wildlife, the kinds of animals that roamed the area, and even a few local legends that made the woods seem even more mysterious. But somewhere along the way, I started to notice something strange. The group had been walking for nearly an hour, and I hadn't thought to check the time, but something felt different. It wasn't until I looked around that I realized the surroundings had changed. The trees were denser now, the trail narrowing, twisting into a part of the forest I didn't recognize. I had hiked here before a few times in the daylight, and yet this part of the trail felt unfamiliar. The trees had become more gnarled, their branches reaching out in strange angles, and the air had grown noticeably colder. I glanced at the others in the group, but no one seemed to notice anything odd. They were all chatting casually, completely unaware of the shift. I took a deep breath, trying to shake off the feeling of unease, but it lingered. I glanced ahead at Tom, expecting to see him pointing out a landmark or sharing a story, but instead he had stopped talking. I hadn't noticed when, but he had fallen silent, walking ahead of the group without saying a word. His back was turned to us and his pace had quickened, almost as if he was in a hurry to reach something ahead. As the group continued on, unaware of the shift in his behavior, but I felt a flicker of something strange. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was walking faster, moving ahead without waiting for us to catch up. It wasn't like him to be so focused on the trail and not engage with the group. I looked back at my friends. Sarah and Mike were still talking, walking side by side, but there was an unease in their voices that I couldn't quite place. They noticed Tom's distance too, but they didn't say anything. We all just kept walking, following the path, the air growing thicker with the silence between us. The quiet seemed heavier now, as if the forest was holding its breath, waiting for something. The irregularity was small at first, a mere shift in the energy of the night, but it deepened as we continued. After a few more minutes, I noticed that the trail seemed to stretch longer than it had before. It wasn't as if we were walking in circles, but the path ahead looked exactly the same as the one behind us. I stopped for a moment, glancing around, but there were no recognizable landmarks. No signs, no familiar trees, just more of the same. The group was still moving ahead, but I couldn't help feeling like we were walking into an unknown part of the forest, a place where the path had been altered somehow. It wasn't until we reached a small clearing that things began to unravel further. Tom had stopped, but he was facing away from us. His back was still turned and his posture was rigid. I couldn't see his face, but his stillness was unsettling. The faint rustle of the wind was the only sound in the clearing, but even that seemed muted, like the forest was holding back its breath. Tom, I called out softly, unsure if he had heard me. There was no response, no acknowledgement. I took a few steps forward, my boots crunching on the gravel, but still he didn't turn around. The group began to gather around, murmurs of confusion rippling through us. Mike, who was always the one to speak up, asked if we should head back, but Tom didn't answer. And then, as if on cue, he turned sharply, facing us. His eyes were wide, his expression blank, almost vacant. It was the first time I had seen him like this, so detached, so empty. I think we've gone off the path, he said, his voice flat. This way. He pointed to the right, but there was no real clarity in his words. He didn't explain how or why we had strayed from the trail, and it struck me then, how could we have gotten lost when this was the same trail we had walked in the daylight? His sudden change in demeanor, the urgency in his voice, caught me off guard. It didn't make sense. I looked at Sarah, who was now visibly nervous, and she stepped forward. "Tom, are we okay?" she asked, her voice laced with hesitation. "You said this was a familiar trail." Tom didn't answer right away. He just stared ahead, his eyes unfocused, as if he couldn't hear us. The stillness was suffocating, and the pressure of being alone in the woods with someone who had led us into this disorienting situation was too much. My skin prickled. The silence stretched out, unbearable. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Tom slowly turned and began walking again, this time with his back to us. He didn't wait for us to catch up. He didn't say anything. And almost against my will, I followed, not because I trusted him, but because I couldn't shake the feeling that we had no choice. We walked for what seemed like hours, deeper and deeper into the woods, the trees closing in around us. The shadows grew longer, and with each step, the sense of being lost, truly lost, became more real. The path had changed completely. I didn't recognize it anymore. The trees were unfamiliar, the ground uneven and rocky, and the air had grown thick with the scent of moss and wet earth. We reached what I could only describe as an ancient stone structure, half buried under a tangle of vines. There was no explanation for it, no sign, nothing to indicate what we were seeing. And when I looked at Tom, his eyes were still wide, his face expressionless. "Where are we?" Mike asked, his voice shaky, but Tom didn't answer. He just stood there looking at the stones as if he had seen this place before. We didn't know what to do, none of us did. The woods had swallowed us, and the guide, our guide, was no longer the person we had met at the start. He wasn't the friendly, knowledgeable hiker we'd signed up for. He was someone else, someone lost. We didn't stay much longer. We turned back, retracing our steps, but the forest didn't feel the same. It felt foreign now, like we had entered a place where time and space no longer made sense. We made it out eventually, back to the clearing where we had started, but Tom was gone, completely gone. No one spoke of it. We never saw him again. Sometimes when I walk in the woods now, I wonder if I ever really left that place. It was one of those ordinary Saturday afternoons, the kind that feels like it will stretch forever. The weather had been cold for a few days, and the chill in the air seemed to seep into the bones of the house, no matter how many layers I put on or how high I cranked up the heater. I didn't mind it too much, though. There was something comforting about the quiet, the stillness that came with cold weather. As I was curled up on the couch with a book, sipping a cup of tea, the sort of peace I didn't get too often in the chaos of work and life. The house I lived in was old, built in the 1920s with creaky floorboards and drafty windows that never seemed to keep the warmth in for long. I'd always loved the character it had, each room with its own little quirks, its own little sounds. The front door didn't close properly, and there was a slight slant to the living room floor that made the coffee table roll toward the wall if it wasn't carefully adjusted. It wasn't a perfect house, but it was mine, and I loved it. That afternoon, I was reading in the living room when I felt it. A sudden, sharp chill. It wasn't like the normal cold that had settled into every corner of the house. This was different. It was localized, a sharp drop in temperature that seemed to appear out of nowhere. At first, I thought it was just a draft from one of the old windows. I glanced up from my book, expecting to see one of the panes rattling in the wind, but nothing looked out of place. The windows were shut tight. The curtains hung perfectly still. It wasn't a draft. I stood up, setting the book aside, and walked over to the spot where I'd felt the coldest. It was near the far wall, by the corner where the room opened up to the hallway. My breath came out in a small puff of condensation, and I instinctively wrapped my arms around myself, shivering despite the thick sweater I was wearing. I placed my hand against the wall, expecting to feel the usual coolness of the old brick. But the wall wasn't just cool, it was ice cold, like the temperature had dropped several degrees right where I was standing. It didn't make sense. I stepped back, confused, and looked around the room. There was no visible reason for it, no breeze or cold spot in the air. The heater was running and the rest of the house felt normal, yet here in this one spot the air felt dense and freezing. It wasn't a draft, it was something more, something deeper. I shrugged it off at first. Maybe the heater had failed to reach that one corner of the room, I thought. But as the evening went on, I began to notice it more and more. It wasn't just in that one spot anymore. The cold began to spread slowly across the living room like it was creeping along the floor inch by inch. At first, I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was all in my head, but it was real. The chill became more persistent, and no matter what I did, it wouldn't go away. I tried adjusting the thermostat, cranking it up higher, but the cold didn't dissipate. I could feel it pressing against me like it was following me as I moved from room to room. It wasn't just uncomfortable anymore, it was unsettling. I could feel the temperature difference between the warm parts of the house and the cold spots, like there was a divide running through the house. I checked the windows, the doors, even the furnace, but everything seemed to be working fine. Nothing explained this. I sat down again, trying to focus on something, anything, to take my mind off the creeping cold that had now made its way into the bedroom. I wrapped myself in a blanket, but it didn't help. The cold was still there, clinging to my skin, biting at the edges of my bones. I felt like it was watching me, like it was something more than just a temperature shift. There was a heaviness to it, something I couldn't explain. It wasn't until I was getting ready for bed that I realized it had grown stronger, more intense. The cold had followed me to the hallway, to the stairs. I stopped at the foot of the stairs, hesitant. The house was always cold at night, but this was different. It felt almost like it was trying to draw me upstairs, pulling at my feet like I had to follow it. I shook my head, telling myself it was just my imagination running wild, but the feeling stayed with me, an oppressive weight that settled in my chest. I forced myself to head upstairs, unable to ignore it any longer. As I walked down the narrow hallway toward my bedroom, I noticed that the cold was especially strong near the old wooden door at the end of the hall, the door to the attic. It had been closed for as long as I'd lived in the house, and I never really thought about it. I wasn't sure why, but tonight something about it felt different. The air around the door seemed thicker, heavier, like it was holding its breath. I hesitated before turning the handle. My heart raced and my breath quickened as I opened the door. The attic stairs creaked under my weight as I stepped onto the first one, and the temperature immediately dropped further. The cold wrapped around me, seeping through the fabric of my clothes, chilling my skin. I had only been up to the attic a handful of times in the years I'd lived there, but this time there was a distinct feeling that I wasn't supposed to be there, that I wasn't welcome. I stepped into the attic, the air thick with dust and the faint smell of old wood. The floorboards creaked beneath my feet, the only sound breaking the silence. But then I noticed something else. There was a strange sensation in the air, like the atmosphere was different up here, heavier, colder than I had ever felt before. My breath was visible now, fogging in front of me as I exhaled. Then I saw it. In the far corner of the attic, where the light from the single bulb above barely reached, there was a small dark shape. At first, I thought it was just a shadow, but as my eyes adjusted to the dim light, I realized it was. It was a figure barely noticeable at first, but unmistakable now that I was closer. A shape standing still just out of the light's reach. My breath caught in my throat, my heartbeat pounding in my ears. I didn't move, I couldn't. The figure wasn't large, but it was there, unmoving, staring into the darkness. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen, just watching it. The cold grew more intense, and for the first time I felt truly scared. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I instinctively stepped backward, my feet scrambling to find solid ground. But just as I moved, the temperature dropped again so sharply that I gasped. I turned, my legs moving on their own now, desperate to leave. I ran down the stairs, the cold following me, never letting up. The moment I reached the bottom of the stairs, the cold lifted. I was back in the warmth of the living room, but the sensation, the feeling of something watching, of something waiting, did not go away. I didn't dare look back at the stairs, at the door that led to the attic. I spent the rest of the night in the living room, under layers of blankets, too afraid to sleep, too afraid to move. The cold never came back, but the lingering unease stayed with me, a feeling that I could never fully shake. It wasn't the cold that bothered me, it was what it meant. I never went up to the attic again. And every time I pass that door, I feel it. The weight of something that shouldn't be there, still waiting in the shadows, hidden just beyond the reach of the light. It was an ordinary Sunday afternoon when I decided to go for a walk in the woods behind my house. I had lived in this old cottage for about 3 years, tucked away on the edge of a small town. The forest stretched for miles behind the property, and though I'd been there countless times, I'd never grown tired of it. The trees were thick, with gnarled roots and branches that twisted together in strange, beautiful patterns. On most days, it was quiet, peaceful even. But today, something felt different. It wasn't obvious at first, just a shift in the air, a slight heaviness that I couldn't quite place. I grabbed my jacket and set out down the familiar trail, the soft crunch of the fallen leaves beneath my boots the only sound breaking the stillness. The weather had turned cooler, autumn in full swing, and the air smelled of damp earth and pine. I had walked this path hundreds of times, but today every step seemed a little louder, a little more deliberate. As I walked deeper into the trees, I could feel the quiet closing in around me, like the forest was becoming thicker, the shadows longer. The wind picked up slightly, making the trees sway, and for a moment I thought I heard something, a faint rustling in the distance. I paused, listening, but the wind picked up again, drowning out whatever sound had been there. I continued on, telling myself it was nothing, but the strange feeling lingered. The trees seemed darker today, the branches leaning closer together, blocking more of the light. The trail, which usually curved gently through the woods, now seemed to stretch on longer than I remembered. I stopped to adjust my jacket, the air growing slightly colder, and when I looked around, I realized I couldn't see the trail behind me anymore. It wasn't that it had disappeared, but it seemed further off, as though the woods had closed in behind me in some subtle, imperceptible way. I took a deep breath and pressed on, trying to shake off the unease that was slowly creeping up my spine. The sun was beginning to dip lower in the sky, casting long, distorted shadows across the path. I should have turned back, I should have gone inside, but something kept pulling me forward, something I couldn't quite explain. As I walked, I thought I heard it again, a whisper, soft but distinct, coming from somewhere deeper in the forest. I froze, my heart suddenly pounding in my chest. I stood there for a moment listening, but the woods were still. Nothing moved. The wind had stopped, and all I could hear was the sound of my own breaths. I told myself it was just the wind, some branch creaking in the distance. I forced my legs to move again, but this time I moved more cautiously, glancing over my shoulder every few steps. The longer I walked, the more aware I became of the silence around me. It wasn't the peaceful quiet I was used to, it was a silence that seemed to have weight to it, like something was watching, waiting. I reached a small clearing, one I had passed through many times before. There was a large rock in the center of the clearing, one I liked to sit on when I needed a break. I walked over and sat down, pulling my legs up to my chest and wrapping my arms around them. The air felt heavier now, and even though I had only been walking for about 20 minutes, it felt as if I had been out here for hours. I glanced around, half expecting to see something in the trees. I don't know what I was expecting, an animal, another hiker, but I saw nothing. I looked up at the sky, watching as the last light of the day slowly faded behind the thick canopy of trees. That was when I heard it again, the whisper. It was soft, almost too quiet to be real, but it was unmistakable. This time it wasn't coming from one direction, it was everywhere, all around me. It wasn't the wind, I was sure of it. The words were indecipherable, but the tone was unmistakable, low, slow, like a conversation I wasn't meant to hear. I stood up quickly, my heart racing, and took a few steps backward, my eyes scanning the trees, but I saw nothing. No movement, no sign of life, just the trees, the thick, dark trees. I was about to leave when I felt it, something cold brushing against my skin. A chill, sharp and sudden, like someone had just run their fingers lightly across my back. I turned, but no one was there. The woods felt even quieter now, the stillness pressing in on me thick and heavy. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that the forest itself was alive, breathing, whispering just out of my reach. I couldn't explain it, but there was something in the air, something that made my skin crawl, a tension that made it hard to breathe. I began to walk quickly, almost jogging now, hopping to shake off whatever strange sensation had settled over me. But the whispers followed. They weren't louder, not really, but they were clearer, more distinct. I couldn't make out the words, but I could feel the presence of whatever was hiding in the trees surrounding me. The whispers grew more insistent, like they were trying to pull me in, make me listen, make me understand. I wasn't sure how long I walked like that, panic rising in my chest with every step. The trees seemed to close in around me, the trail narrowing. It was as if I were walking through a tunnel, the darkness pressing on all sides. The whispers never stopped, and every few steps I'd feel that cold, unnatural chill brush against my skin again, just a fleeting touch, but enough to send a jolt of fear through me. Finally, I burst out of the trees and into the open field near my house. I kept running, not looking back until I reached my front door, my heart still pounding. I didn't stop until I was inside, the door locked behind me. I collapsed against the door, trying to catch my breath, my hands shaking. But the whispers didn't stop. They followed me inside, echoing in my mind, too close, too real. The silence of the house felt suffocating, and I couldn't escape the feeling that the woods were still out there, waiting for me to return. I don't know how long I sat there, my heart slowly returning to normal, but the whispers didn't fade. They didn't stop. To this day, when I walk through those woods, I can still hear them. The whispers, soft and low, hiding just behind the rustle of the leaves, always just out of reach. I don't know who or what they belong to. All I know is that I'll never forget the feeling of being surrounded by them, trapped in a place where the trees are more than just trees, where the wind is more than just wind. Sometimes, when the night is still and the wind is quiet, I hear them again, soft and distant, just outside my window. And I know I'll never walk in those woods alone again. There's something about the night that brings out the truth in the quietest corners of the world. Maybe it's the stillness, the way everything seems to stop, and in that pause the hidden things come forward unnoticed in the daylight. We walk into the dark expecting it to be safe, familiar, only to realize how easily it can become unfamiliar, even dangerous. The night, it seems, isn't always empty. Sometimes it holds onto more than we think. I wonder if you've ever felt it, the strange pull, the creeping sensation that something's just out of reach, lurking in the shadows. It's almost as if in those moments when we can't see what's ahead, the world remembers things we've long forgotten. Maybe that's why we keep coming back to these stories. Not just because they scare us, but because in the darkness, we're reminded that even the familiar can turn on us when we least expect it. And maybe, just maybe, it's that unsettling feeling that keeps us searching for more. So I'm grateful you stayed with me tonight, sharing these quiet hours. If you find yourself drawn back to the woods, to the dark corners of the world, don't forget what we've learned. Some paths are better left unexplored. But if you ever want to hear more, if the whispers of the dark call you back, there will always be another story waiting. So for now, sleep well. May the silence of the night stay with you, and the whispers, if they do come, stay just beyond reach. Sweet dreams.